Een zonnergedal langs die Moertiefse wal, het zij voor oorlogsdagen blij. O, breng mij terug naar die oud-Transvaal, daar waar mijn Sarre woont. Daar onder in die milis bij die groendoornboom.
Judgement, Carbineers, at ease, stand down. Well, it's come to this. At last it's come to this. The Carbineers are to be broken up. The unit is disbanded. The officers have been court-martialed, found guilty, or some of them. Those of you that are keen on conspiracy theories, conveniently most of the documentation of the court case has been lost or was destroyed by the British authorities, and there's very little left in South Africa or indeed Australia. There are letters written to the papers. There's a little bit of stuff that's been kept. There's a fellow in South Africa, Professor Schulenberg or something, Dr. Schulenberg. He's managed to acquire most of it. There's Sergeant Sam Carter. Get away! Get away! Come on! Get away! Come on! He wants to fight his sister. For him, the war never ends. Yeah, so there's a little bit that we'll hear about today. I've also got a bit of live film footage for you. I actually got to go into the courthouse where the court of inquiry and the first half of the court-martial were held in Pietersburg. I also got to go to the train station, not the actual one, but the same building was transferred up to Louis Trichardt, and I got to see the corridor where the accused men were marched and put on the train for the long ride down to Pretoria. Also got to see the grave of Handcock and Morant, and I'll show you the actual film footage from all of that. I don't want to talk too much because we've got a lot to get through in this episode. We're going to try and wind it up. Maybe I'll break it into two, but I'd rather not do that. You're either into it or you're not. You're either vaguely interested or you're not. Yeah, I won't talk anymore. Put your horses away, fold up your uniforms and stick them in a trunk under your bed to think back in days to come. Sit on your porches and in your rocking chairs with your pipe and your glass of port, and remember the days in the Spelonken fighting the Boer on the veldt. Okay, Judgement, over, out. And so to the matter at hand. So in Charles's book on the court of inquiry followed by the court-martial, he notes that, as I said, that most of the material has disappeared. It was destroyed by the British authorities. So there is a fellow called Dr. Schulenberg, who is one of the leading authorities in South Africa on the Bushveldt Carbineers, and he's done a lot of research and writing to the War Office in London, and the replies that he got were that the laws have changed, but back in the 1920s they didn't want to keep material from court-martials, and so all the documentation was pretty much destroyed. These days the documentation would be kept, but back in those days the material was all destroyed. So we only really have Lieutenant Whitten's account, which was from memory, in the Scapegoats of the Empire, but we also have a bit from Major Thomas. Now, he was the defence lawyer. He was actually brought in, I didn't know this, he was brought in to represent Lenihan, but he took on the cases of the other guys as well on just the night before the court of inquiry. Major Thomas always said that he had documentation that would come out one day which would tell the whole story and be the truth. And he wrote a lot of letters to the newspapers when he got back to Australia, but for some reason he never released that documentation. He said he had, so we'll never really know what he was talking about. So the only records we have are from newspapers of the time and Major Whitten. But there is something here now. Yeah, I did go to that courthouse or the house they used in Petersburg. I'm sure the court of inquiry was in that house, and you'll see some footage from that in this episode.
That informed the British about critical,
evidence.
Or evidence, yeah.
Sure.
And he was then court-martialed here.
Oh,
yeah.
wow. So we're really lucky, folks. We've been allowed into the garden. I'll just walk along the porch and then I'll come out.
You're welcome.
Oh, fantastic.
Inside as well.
Oh, can we?
Yeah.
The smell. Is that frangipani or jasmine?
Jasmine, yeah.
Wow. And I think, well, I'm not sure. I did ask Charles. I think the court-martial started in that house, but then was transferred to Pretoria for the verdicts. Anyway, so this says, Dr. Schulenberg, one of South Africa's foremost authorities on the Bushveldt Carbineers, he quotes from his own extensive research as well as Australian and other South African sources. So the Court of Inquiry. On the 16th of October, a Court of Inquiry was convened at Pietersburg with the objective of establishing what charges could be brought against the officers who were still being held in solitary confinement. This was the British idea of a grand jury to present a case to the forthcoming court-martial. The president of the court was Colonel Carter, his secretary Captain Evans, and an additional member. There's that Major Bolton, him again. The first sitting was held on the 6th of November 1901 and the court sat for 4 weeks. Deliberations lasted another fortnight and it became clear that the main indictment would be directed against Lieutenants Morant, Handcock, Whitten and Picton. During this entire period, all the accused, as well as 3 other Australians, Major Lenihan, Lieutenant Hannam and Sergeant Major Hammer, as well as Taylor, were kept in solitary confinement. Nobody, not even the prison chaplain, was permitted to visit them. They were not allowed to obtain advice for their defence until the evening before the start of the court-martial. And they were not to communicate with each other. They were not informed of the charges against them. They all assumed that they had simply done their duty according to orders from the higher authority. Yeah, I reckon that's in that house I visited. That court of inquiry would have been held. So we're very lucky. Hello. Do you know when the house was built? Any idea? Or?
I'll probably be able to find the information for you and send it on if you want.
Yeah. And now it's a storeroom for the big hotel across the road. And maybe a bit of training. You do training here?
Facility, yeah.
Wow. Oh, look at this. Wow, folks. Wow, look at this.
The original house stopped here, where the stores are.
I see. Yeah, that's new. Wow. Wow, look at that. So this is the actual house where the court-martial took place. My God, so lucky. Oh. The roof, the big high ceiling, and you can feel the history, people. In summer, it would be lovely and cool in here. Yeah, okay. Storage. Oh, look at the paintings. Original floorboards. Wow, look at it. I'm touching them, folks. This is where they marched. That's plenty, thank you. Thank you so much. I'll just walk along the porch quickly. Wow, look at it. Old stables over there. The click, click, click of the boots. Remember that scene when he marches in and he pivots and he turns and he stomps his foot again and he salutes the The officers sat at the table. One by one they come in, present themselves. Lieutenant Harry Morant, Bushveldt Carbineers. Lieutenant George Whitten. Alright, well the lady's done more than enough, so we were so lucky. I thought I was in trouble because I was filming without permission. And then Schulenberg's got another few words here on the court-martial. The first court-martial opened on the 16th of January 1902. Lieutenant Colonel H.C. Denny presided with 6 members. A Major J.F. Thomas of New South Wales Mounted Rifles, a country solicitor from Tenterfield, New South Wales, was to defend Major Lenihan, but agreed the evening before to appear also for the other accused. The court sat in secret, contrary to regulations which stipulated that all court-martials will be open to the public, civilian as well as military, and the press. Yeah, we never see anything of Major Lenihan, I don't think, in the movie Breaker Morant. So the first interruption to the court proceedings occurred on the night of the 22nd and 23rd of January 1902 at 2 a.m. in the morning, when Assistant Commandant General Bayers attacked the Pietersburg military headquarters as well as the concentration camp and liberated 151 Boer prisoners. But many of those Boers returned of their own choice to the concentration camp the next day. Now that's a big scene in the movie, and you guys are going to see. I went to the fort where they filmed that scene. I mean, in the movie, it's quite unrealistic. These Boers attack on horseback. They're lighting dynamite from their cigars and tossing dynamite over the fort walls as explosions. Of course, Morant, the leading actor, ends up on the Gatling gun, and they're mowing down Boers, and there's British being shot. Nothing like that happened, according to Charles. But yeah, it was a movie. It had to be dramatic. So the reason for the attack was not to disrupt the sitting of the court, but it was aimed primarily at increasing the manpower of the commando and the acquisition of much-needed horses, a commodity that Bayer's commando now critically lacked. The imprisoned Bushveldt Carbineer officers were immediately issued with rifles. Well, we see that in the movie. And together with the rest of the garrison, they fought off the attack. After Bayers had retreated, Morant, Handcock, Whitten, and presumably the other prisoners were relieved of their rifles, and the court proceeded as usual on the same day. But anyway, Dr. Schulenberg's report of the trial continues. The 6 Boers incident and the Van Buren incident. So Colonel Hall, officer commanding in Petersburg, had exonerated Captain Robinson and Sergeant Major Morrison of all blame concerning the murder of the 6 Boers. So Robinson had been brought back from Durban to turn, he served as a Crown witness. Hall was transferred to India even before the sittings began. Robinson turned Crown witness. He, as well as Morrison and Taylor, were found not guilty of any charges. That was the murder of the 6 Boers that were coming in, where the old fella had the gold, and Van Buren was the Boer turner that was shot in the back. So only Major Lenihan was punished for Van Buren's death, and that only because he failed to report the incident. He also omitted to report the murder of the 3 Boers, the Van Stadens. They were the last ones, I think, that were shot and made to dig their own graves. He was reprimanded and sent back to Australia. According to reports and legend, Taylor returned to Rhodesia, where he was shot by Van Buren's brother in a bar. This is untrue. According to documents in the National Archives of Salisbury, Taylor died on the 24th of October 1941 at Bulawayo of cholecystitis and pneumonia. Let's look at the Fisser incident. Dr. Schulenberg's report says Morant's defence was that he only carried out orders from a higher authority, namely that no prisoners were to be brought in, and that he shot a Boer who was wearing British uniform. From the evidence, it was clear, however, that vengeance played a part in Morant's action. Morant was livid because he believed the Boers were responsible for mutilating Hunt's body after death. In fact, the bodies of both Hunt and Viljoen, the Boer, had been mutilated. Morant was found guilty for the murder of Floris Visser and his accomplices. Handcock, Whitten and Picton were found guilty of manslaughter. There's a little addendum here. Captain Taylor was only charged with the murder of the 6 Boers, but as he had resigned his commission in the military upon his arrest 3 months earlier, by law he should have been tried by a military court under martial law, not by a court-martial under the Army Act, as was the case. The verdict was not guilty. Taylor was then discharged and he returned almost immediately to Rhodesia. So we do have a handwritten document by Colonel St. Clair and Colonel Pemberton. It's regarding the killing, I'll read it to you. Lieutenants Morant, Handcock and Whitten. I consider that the above officers were rightly found guilty to the charge preferred against them. The evidence shows that they took the law into their own hands, an illegal proceeding for which they should take the consequences. The plea of justification falls to the ground. That's for the killing of the 8 Boers, the surrendered 8 Boers. Now for the matter of the 3 Boers, Lieutenants Morant and Handcock, I consider were rightly convicted. Lieutenant Morant evidently constituted himself the avenger of Captain Hunt and should take the consequences. Okay, Lieutenant Whitten, who was present while the Visser incident was under examination, records the verbal exchanges between the President of the Court and Morant as follows. We see this in the movie. It's one of the highlights of the movie. So, was your court at the trial of Visser constituted like this? Asked the President. And did you observe paragraph, that's blotted out, of section, blotted out, of the King's regulations? I can't do the voice, but was it like this? Fiercely answered Morant. No, it was not quite so handsome. As to rules and sections, we had no red book and knew nothing about them. We were out fighting the Boers, not sitting comfortably behind barbed wire entanglements. We got them and shot them under Rule 303. He says it a lot more elegantly in the movie, doesn't he? So regarding that famous speech, and it is a highlight of the film, so Mark Cryle refers to the very first book on this topic. The book was called the book was by Frank Renard, and it's called Bushman and Buccaneer, Harry Morant, His Ventures and Verses, and it was published in Sydney 1902. So it was just 6 weeks after the news had broken in Australia. The book was based in part on manuscripts and letters received from Major Lenihan, but also invented dialogue to colour the executions with fearless heroism. He also notes that it's very likely that the much-quoted Rule 303 statement accredited to Morant could actually have been Frank Renard's creative journalism at work. The same applies to the equally famous and supposedly last words of Morant, "Shoot straight, you bastards, don't make a mess of it." So maybe it was the author, Frank Renard, had invented that those little snippets of dialogue.
Was your court at the trial of Visser constituted in any way like this? What rule did you shoot him under?
Like this? Oh, no, sir, no, it wasn't quite like this. No, sir, it wasn't quite so handsome. And as for rules, we didn't carry military manuals around with us. We were out on the veldt, fighting the Boer, the way he fought us. I'll tell you what rule we applied, sir. We applied Rule 303.
So Dr. Schulenberg's report continues. The 8 Boers incident. Morant, Handcock and Whitten were found guilty of the murder of the 8 Boers. Morant's defence was again that he was merely carrying out orders from senior officers and not to bring in any more prisoners. The murder of the German missionary Heese. A second court-martial was convened for this charge with Lieutenant Colonel McBean as president, together with 6 members. Handcock was charged with the murder under orders and instigation of Morant. There was circumstantial evidence by several people, including H. van Rooyen, but there were no eyewitnesses. Handcock had a strong alibi in his claim that on the day of the murder he was with Mrs. Schiele at Rosbach. Well, we've heard lots of her, haven't we, in the earlier episodes. We even saw photos of Rosbach, the farm. Anyway, he was with her until after midday, and then with Mrs. Olivia Bristow at Sweetwaters until sunset. You've got to say, Handcock's an energetic young man, isn't he? To do those three things in one day. Anyway, both ladies testified in Handcock's favour. They must have liked him. The court had no option but to find both the accused not guilty of the crime, though it was said that most of the members believed in their guilt. After the verdicts became known, 2 members of the court-martial sent the accused 6 bottles of champagne, and they were allowed to celebrate in prison. Yeah, we see that in the movie. I also got to see that section of the fort where they filmed that celebration with the champagne. They thought they were off the hook, but not to be. The 3 Boers incident. Morant and Handcock were accused of ordering certain troopers and a corporal to shoot 3 Boers. They were found guilty. No charges were laid against any officers for the murders of the black assistants who were with the group of Boers and had been witness to the actions of the Bushveldt Carbineers patrols. At least 8 such murders are known to have been committed. So that tells you how highly they valued the poor black assistants and workers of these guys, doesn't it? Okay, well, yeah, this is interesting. So the court-martial is adjourned and reconvened in Pretoria. So that's when the house I visited in Pietersburg was vacated, and then they would have moved it all down to Pretoria. And I think I'm going to show you guys some footage of the train station at Louis Trichardt. And there's that tunnel that Charles told me that Handcock and Witten were marched down through that tunnel and taken to Pretoria on the train. But the station has been moved, right? So that station you're going to see was in Pietersburg, and must have been a hell of a job. But they moved it and reconstructed it at Louis Trichardt. This was Tim Fisher that was here. Charles is doing.
I never forget that man's size.
Yeah.
Hands like a bunch of bananas.
Yeah.
But a lovely man.
This beautiful old station. We haven't been to a train station before.
So, as I say, all these fire extinguishers and hose pipes are all add-ons in an attempt to revive.
How did Morant and Handcock get to Pretoria? On train or?
Train. Not Morant. Morant wasn't with them at the time. He had gone to Pretoria to attend to what he said to Hunt's will, because he said that Hunt had left him his polo ponies. So he wrote to Colonel Hall asking permission. That was after the capture of Kelly, Commandant Kelly. No, he wasn't Commandant anymore, Falconet. So Morant was in Pretoria already. But those guys went through this very passageway here. I'll show you now.
Look at the old, I
access.
was going to say the old crown.
Anyway, this is a little bit of British heritage here.
Yeah.
In the far north. So you asked where they walked out.
Yeah.
They came out of here. They came through this portal because this would have been the access to the train that was waiting to take them to Pretoria. That's what I surmise.
You think Witten and Handcock came through here?
They probably walked through.
Oh, there's an old steam train.
That's also all the copper and brass has all been stolen.
Right.
But it's just my opinion. Because I know that when we used to go to boarding schools, we'd all sit on the benches out here, and when the train came, we'd all jump up and with our tickets. This was usually the ticket office was here, and then we'd jump onto the train, and this is where we had access to the actual train.
I don't know where Morant was. Maybe he was on the train with them, but I've got the impression that he went separately. But we might find out. Anyway, this is what's happened. The court-martial is adjourned and is reconvened in Pretoria. So at the end of the first sitting of the first court-martial, The entire court adjourned and moved to Pretoria on the 24th of January 1902 to hear evidence from Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton, Kitchener's military secretary, concerning the formulation and dissemination of orders from that office. The following is his evidence here. That's that scene we see that Major Thomas goes to Pretoria to Kitchener's office. Kitchener is conveniently out, and we see his assistant or his secretary talk to Major Thomas. Now, Colonel Hamilton, I'm pretty sure, is the British officer that was in charge. He stayed on the ship at Gallipoli and directed the landings of Gallipoli from the ship. But anyway, I digress. So this is his evidence, examined by the court. Lieutenant Morant, in his evidence, states that the late Captain Hunt told him that he had received orders from you that no prisoners were to be taken alive. Is this true? Hamilton says absolutely untrue. He's examined by the counsel for the prisoners, so Major Thomas, I guess. Do you remember Captain Hunt taking 2 polo ponies earlier in July last up to Lord Kitchener's quarters, at which time you came in and had a conversation with Captain Hunt? Hamilton says, no, I have no recollection whatever. I've never spoken to Captain Hunt with reference to his duties in the Northern Transvaal. Major Thomas, in his address, made a rather muddled objection to Colonel Hamilton's evidence, but he emphasised the question of what orders Captain Hunt had given his subordinates. His main submission, however, was that those charged were charged as accessories to the crime and could not be convicted unless the guilt of the principals first be established. The principals, those who fired the shots, were not, he argued, guilty because they had acted under orders. There's a great deal of cross-examination took place concerning the wearing of uniforms without the deliberate intention of deceiving the enemy as being legal reason for execution. The validity of illegal orders with regard to the unprovoked shooting of unarmed as well as wounded prisoners, concluding with, the right of killing an armed man exists only so long as he resists. Soon as he submits, he is entitled to be treated as a prisoner of war. Yeah, well, that's the case of that fellow they shot in the long grass at Pietersburg, because he threw up his hands and said, I surrendered, and then they shot him. Anyway, the court, they've gone back to Pietersburg. That throws out my theory. The court returns to Pietersburg, 270 kilometres to the north, on the 31st of January. Okay, so they only went down to Pretoria to hear Hamilton. Why couldn't he get the train up? Maybe he was too busy to travel. The prisoners were returned in a wretched railway carriage in much reduced circumstances. It must be wearing them out. I guess the pennies dropped. That they're in real doo-doo here. At Warm Baths, 90 kilometres north of Pretoria, the train was stopped. The accused were armed and told to help defend the train as a Boer attack seemed imminent. When the attack failed to take place, they were disarmed and the journey proceeded. There's that Warm Baths again. Handcock had apparently signed a confession admitting to his guilt in the Heath as well as other cases, but said he had merely done so to please Colonel Carter. However, later he retracted his confession in court. No reasons were recorded for Handcock's change of mind. Would his confession perhaps have implicated the officers who decided that Heath should be eliminated? By this stage, both trumpeter Sergeant Wrench and trooper Thanes Boerter had turned Crown witness. Now, Thanes Boerter is Morant's batman. Though it cannot be proved, the reason for some troopers turning Crown witness could have been that as the trial progressed, the gravity of the charges and the likelihood of a verdict of guilty became more of a reality. After the lengthy processing of all the charges against them, the accused had still not been informed of the verdicts reached by the court. Couple of there's an article about the train wrecked by the Boers. So Whitten remembers the incident about the derailed train. Leaving Neilstroom for Pietersburg, we passed a spot at Naboomspruit, which was marked by 19 fresh graves. Only a few days before, a train had been wrecked there by Boers. An officer, Lieutenant Best of the Gordon Highlanders, a personal friend of the late Captain Hunt, and Lieutenant Morant, had been killed. Also 18 men, including the driver, fireman and guard of the train. I saw the truck at Warmbath Station in which these men were shot down. The iron walls had been about as much protection from the mouths of bullets as a sheet of paper. The truck was riddled like a sieve. Anyway, back to the matter at hand. According to a legal expert, it's regarded as first prize for the prosecution when the accused admits under cross-examination that he committed the deed for which he had been charged. This paves the way for further process if necessary. So yeah, Morant never denied that he shot them, that he claims that he was that was the order. Morant confessed more than once that they'd shot prisoners, but they'd done so under orders. Despite an inquiry in Kitchener's Pretoria headquarters, no written orders for this effect could be produced. Well, I would say that's convenient, but make up your own minds. On the evening of 20th of February, the last remaining prisoners were treated to a fine dinner in the jail with Major Thomas, their defending attorney, as their guest Lieutenant Whitten described the evening as follows, quote, "As if to fill up our cup of joy to the very brim, an orderly from the brigade office came and informed Morant that a staff officer had said in his hearing that the result of the court-martial was that he and his subordinates were exonerated. This bit of news greatly elated us, and in high spirits at the thought of freedom in the morrow, I returned to my quarters near the Cow Gun about 10 o'clock, where I was met by the officer in charge, who informed me that he had orders to move me to the garrison prison there and then. After protesting against moving at such an unseemly hour, I had my bedding packed up and returned to the scene of our festival at the prison. I made a shakedown in Handcock's room and turned in, fully expecting this would be my last night of my imprisonment. Next morning, 21st of February 1902, the accused were woken early, informed that they were to be transported to Pretoria by train. Okay, well, this might be that scene that I filmed at Louis Trichardt. After packing their gear and having breakfast, Lieutenants Morant, Handcock, Whitten and Picton were handcuffed. Major Lenihan remained unrestrained. They were escorted to Pietersburg Station, placed in 2 closed rail trucks with an officer and 6 guards assigned to each truck. They would remain thus for the entire 30-hour journey back to Pretoria. Bloody hell, that's a long trip. Took me about 4 hours. Anyway, when he learned of their removal, Major Thomas was furious at not having been informed, and he then rushed to Pretoria on the next train. After their arrival and their admission to the prison in Pretoria, the officers were jailed for 4 days. They were still completely unaware of the fate that awaited them. Neither had they been informed that the court-martials had found them guilty on 12 counts of murder, namely the murder of 8 Boers on the farm at Ballymore, the murder of the wounded Floris Visser, the murder of the 3 Van Stadens on Sweetwaters. They were found not guilty of the murder of the Reverend Heath, and they had not been charged with the murder of the 6 Boers at Valdezia, or that of the Grobler boys, or the murder of any of the 8 black witnesses. There's a little bit of documentation survived. This is a telegram from Army Headquarters, Pretoria, 21st of February 1902. Provost Marshal. The following telegram has been dispatched to the officer in command, LOC, North Petersburg. Quote, February the 18th, a 9525, send prisoners Major Lenihan, Lieutenants Morant, Picton, Handcock, Whitten to Pretoria under an adequate escort commanded by a competent officer. They are all to be handcuffed except Major Lenihan. Every precaution must be taken against possibility of escape. Report departure to this office and GOC Pretoria, giving name of officer commanding, acknowledge. The GOC Pretoria has been instructed to have the prisoners and escort met on arrival and to arrange for the safe custody of the former in Pretoria. The finding and sentence of the court in the case of Major Lenihan will be promulgated as soon as practical. after his arrival, and he's then to be dispatched to Cape Town and embarked for Australia as quickly as possible. Will you be so good as to take steps to have him carefully supervised until he actually sails? That's signed by Major, it's hard to read, Wigham. So the execution. So a day or two after their admission to the prison in Pretoria, the prisoners were visited by Captain Putland, Inspector of Prisons and a friend of Morant's. At Morant's request, most of the prison disciplinary regulations were relaxed. Their individual cells were thrown open from sunrise until 7 in the evening. During the day, they associated freely with each other and enjoyed cigarettes and tobacco that had been sent to them. It was apparently during this time that Morant, who felt insulted by a prison guard, turned on him and exclaimed that he would not be spoken to like that, as he was a British officer, not being convicted of any crime. On Thursday, the 26th of February 1902, they were individually informed of their sentences by the prison governor. Morant was first to be informed. We have Whitten's description, which is thought to be the most accurate. So Morant walked over and in a few minutes returned. His face was deathly pale. He looked as though his heart had already ceased to beat. I exclaimed, "Good God, Morant, what is the matter?" "Shot tomorrow morning," was the reply. Handcock was called next. When he returned, he appeared quite unconcerned. "Well, what is it?" I asked. "Same as Morant," he wearily replied, as though he was tired of it all and relieved that the end had come at last. And I was next called and walked across the yard quite prepared for and fully expecting the same fate as the others. Being ushered into the governor's office, I was taken before Captain Hudson, Provost Marshal of Pretoria. Glancing at me, he said, "George Ramsdale Whitten, you've been found guilty of murder and sentenced to death." He paused for a time, as if to give me the full grasp of that sentence, but then he continued, "Lord Kitchener has been pleased to commute your sentence to penal servitude for life." I was then marched out feeling quite resentful that my sentence had been commuted, as I felt that death 1,000 times would be preferable to the degradation of a felon's life. I'd already suffered 12 times over pangs worse than death. Lieutenant Picton was the next called. He soon returned. "Well, what luck?" I asked. "Found guilty of manslaughter and cashiered," was his reply. The appalling injustice of the sentences was a terrible blow to us. According to Woolmore, former Captain Robinson related how he was personally sent to collect the death warrants for Morant and Handcock from Kitchener, whose Melrose House headquarters were not far from the old prison. I also went there. I might show you a bit of footage of the Melrose House, which is closed now. But it used to be a museum you could go into. I think that's where they signed the peace treaty. Robertson stated the Commander-in-Chief signed them in front of him and handing them over with his customary steely stare declared, "Think yourself lucky that you're not amongst them." The impact of the sentences was stunning. The lieutenants requested writing materials and letters were immediately written to Kitchener, family members in Australia as well as to the Australian government. Telegrams were also sent. But some of this mail apparently never even left Pretoria, while certain letters did arrive at their destinations. This is quite sad. Lieutenant Peter Handcock wrote to his sister on the night before he was executed, so the 27th of February 1902. "Dear sister, I've but an hour or so longer to exist, and although my brain has been harried for 4 long, weary months, I can't refrain from writing you a last few lines. I'm going to find out the grand secret. I will face my God with a firm belief that I am innocent of murder. I obeyed my orders and served my king as I thought best. If I overstep my duty, I can only ask my people and country for forgiveness. Tell poor Polly to take care of little Ilham for me at all costs. They are my greatest comforts at home and my greatest trouble now. I hope my country will see my children cared for. I will die brave for the sake of all. God forgive my enemies and give you peace forever. I've not heard if our brother Eugene was killed in this wretched war or not, but if not, tell him and Will I've gone to rest. Tell Peter and Willie to be good for their sister. God be with you in your trouble. From your fond brother, P.J. Handcock, Australia forever. Amen. Best love from Coco to all old friends, especially P. Benahan and G. Simon and Gibbons was one of my best here, a Bathurst boy. So Thomas desperately tried to contact Kitchener, but was informed that the Commander-in-Chief was away and only expected back after a few days. Thomas then begged Colonel Kelly to grant a stay of execution so as to give him time to appeal to King Edward, but was informed the sentence had already been referred to England and approved by the authorities there. Yeah, we see a bit of that in the movie. Whitten comments that after the passing of the sentence of Morant, he was asked by a prison officer if he wished to see a clergyman. No, he replied in an abrupt manner. I am a pagan. Handcock asked what a pagan was, and being informed, he replied, I'm a pagan too. This response could have been a result of raw shock and dismay at the outcome of the trial. So Picton was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to be cashiered. This effectively ended his ambition of making the military his career. He was also deprived of both his Distinguished Conduct Medal, which had been awarded for outstanding bravery at Boteville, as well as his war medal with 6 fighting bars. The severity of such a sentence cannot be downplayed in military terms, but also cannot be seen as adequate justice for the part he played in the particularly brutal murder of Florist Visser. An interesting piece of local history was written in the last days or hours before the execution of Morant and Handcock. Yeah, and this is what Charles mentioned to me in the car when we were touring. So it's concerning Bota, the Batman, not Batman and Robin, Morant's Batman, right? Okay, so it's well known that Trooper Tanis Bota quickly turned Crown's evidence at the onset of the court-martial. He was the joiner who became Morant's Batman. He was the man who requested permission from Lieutenant Morant to shoot Chris, the younger of the Van Staden boys. He was also the witness who testified in court that the only man wearing parts of Hunt's uniform when Visser was killed was Morant himself. Local legend states categorically that Trooper Bota was in the street outside the Pretoria Central Prison a day or so before the execution of the 2 officers. It was claimed that he was seated on a white horse when out of the blue a rifle shot rang out and Bota fell dead in the street. Well, in the movie, and I did recreate that, and I'll show you guys again, Bota is shot dead in a side street while the band is playing in the rotunda. So the question remains unanswered is, was Bota shot by a sniper from within the prison or by somebody in the street? And then the other question is, what the hell was he doing outside the prison in Pretoria? 2 possible answers. The first is that Trooper Bota was a joiner, and that he had shot the Van Staden boy, was in the firing squad that had shot Visser. His safety or even his life was certainly at risk amongst the Boers. Therefore, Bota could have been shot by a Boer. This is an unsafe assumption to make, as it would imply that an armed Boer who knew all about Bota was dangerously close to the prison that was under British military. Second possible answer is that Trooper Bota's conscience has finally got the better of him, and he'd gone to Pretoria to make his peace with his ex-commanding officer, with one of the Australian prison personnel decided to even the score on Morant's behalf. It's common knowledge that Morant and Handcock were buried by Australians after the execution. There was some in that vicinity. Whatever the answer to this local legend might be, Bota's murder was apparently never identified, nor do we have a record of his grave. Once again, the last hours of Morant and Handcock's life are described by George Whitten. 5 the next morning, the 27th of February, I was roused by a warder who informed me that an escort was waiting for me as soon as I was ready. I asked permission to say goodbye to Morant and Handcock. I was allowed to see them only through the small trapdoor. I clasped their hands through this for the last time and could scarcely stammer a goodbye. I was more unnerved at the thought of their hateful death than they were themselves. They were calmly prepared to meet their death, as they often had been before, at times during the war. Were then taken away to the chief warder's office, handcuffed and handed over an escort of Cameron Highlanders waiting to be admitted. It was unnecessary to ask why or what they were there for. It was a heartbreaking sight.
I was told that at 6 o'clock the warders threw open the door of the doomed men's cells and asked, "Are you ready?" "Yes," replied Morant. "Where is your firing party?" Hand in hand in the grey light of the dawn they walked out to the death to Lieutenant Edwards. Morant said, "Remember the Boers mutilated my friend Hunt. I shot those who did it. We had our orders. I only obeyed them when Hunt was murdered. I did it. Whitten and Picton had nothing to do with it. I told them so at the court-martial." They faced the firing party unflinchingly. While waiting at the Pretoria railway station, I distinctly heard in the clear morning air the report of the volley of the firing party, the death knell of my late comrades, and I knew they had gone to that bourne from whence no traveller returns. So went out two brave and fearless soldiers, men that the Empire could ill afford to lose. It was Morant's last wish that he should be buried decently and outside the precincts of the prison. Some comrades claimed the bodies and interred them in the Pretoria cemetery. There, Morant and Handcock went into their last long lager. I shudder now as I write this and recall those awful days so vividly impressed in my memory. I think we see that in the film. We see Whitten sitting at Pretoria station waiting for the train, and suddenly the pigeons are startled by the sound of the firing squad. They were shot by... This is back to Charles's book. They were shot by the Cameron Highlanders under the command of Major Sota. Different versions regarding the last words, if any, spoken by Morant. It's presumed they were invented by the author Frank Renner, who was not present and could not have spoken to any witnesses before writing them in his own book. These words, whether actually muttered by Morant or not, were used in part as the title of the book by Nick Blazinski. "Shoot straight, you bastards, and don't make a mess of it." According to Walmore, Morant had expressed a last wish that he was not to be buried inside prison walls. A group of friends, mostly Australians, claimed the two bodies, and later that day a procession made its way to the Pretoria Cemetery on the northern side of Church Street in what is now the old section, where both coffins were lowered into the same grave. Headstone has been changed over the years, as evident from photos taken at different times. So I can show you those photos as they've changed. And I'll show you a bit of footage of me at the cemetery when I went and found the grave. So it's not hard to find because it's the only one signposted. Even Kruger doesn't have a signposted grave. Major Thomas had gone to great lengths to procure a stay of execution and was deeply affected by the most unexpected turn of events. In a letter to Major Lenihan dated 27th of February 1902, the day of the execution, he wrote, "Full of bitterness, I cannot express my feelings, but when the time comes, if I am spared, I will. I know that all that I expect will ever be known. I am too true an Australian to shirk plain speaking if need be, and need there will be, I think. What I resent was dragging out a lot of details unless it was essential. I did not contemplate a sudden and unappealable death sentence. I thought the absolute acquittal in the Heath case would mean at most a term of penal servitude which could be remitted later on." Whitten's taken to the military prison in Cape Town, the castle. He sees Lenihan and Lieutenant Picton again. They were both detained while they were being sent back to Australia. But Whitten goes from Cape Town aboard the Canada on the 9th of May 1902. And after a really long voyage, he arrives in England about the 2nd of April to begin serving a life sentence. Whitten's initially imprisoned at the Gosport military prison, then he's transferred to Lewes and eventually to Portland convict prison. There's a petition with about 80,000 names given to the British authorities to secure his release, but it was only after the involvement of Mrs. George Keppel, who had connections with King Edward, that Whitten's release was announced on the 12th of August 1904. His Majesty the King has been pleased, on recommendation of Army Council, to remit unexpired portions of sentence on Whitten. So he was released from prison and he returned to Australia to write and publish his book, Scapegoats of the Empire, in 1907. Australians were deeply affected by the events concerning the execution of their officers in South Africa. Explanations and answers to questions were demanded of the British military. Lord Kitchener sent an official reply to the Governor-General of Australia. So this is Kitchener's reply, published on the 7th of April 1902. In reply to your telegram, Morant, Handcock and Whitten were charged with 20 separate murders, including one of a German missionary who had witnessed other murders. 12 of these murders were proved. From evidence, it appears that Morant was the originator of the crimes, which Handcock carried out in a cold-blooded manner. The murders were committed in the wildest part of the Transvaal, known as Spelonken, about 80 miles north of Pretoria, on 4 separate dates, namely 2nd of July, 11th of August, 23rd of August, 7th of September, in one case where 8 Boer prisoners were murdered. It was alleged in defence to have been done in a spirit of revenge for the ill treatment of one of their officers, Lieutenant Hunt, he calls him, who was killed in action. No such ill treatment was proved. The prisoners were convicted after a most exhaustive trial and were defended by counsel. There were, in my opinion, no extenuating circumstances. Lieutenant Whitten was also convicted, but I commuted his sentence to penal servitude for life in consideration of his having been under the influence of Morant and Handcock. The proceedings have been sent home. When the news broke in Australia a few weeks later, the article below appeared in the bulletin on the 12th of April 1902, quote, "The Australian officers were in part victims at least of their ignorance of military law and of the brutal homicidal carelessness, or worse, of the Kitchener gang in appointing blacksmiths, drovers and whatnot as responsible military officers in disturbed districts." Concluded, "We repeat, the chief responsibility must rest with the persons who were guilty of the criminal carelessness or sanguinary design of letting their irregulars loose on the Boers." After the execution, a distraught, if not traumatised, Major Thomas wrote to several senior politicians, newspaper editors and others who had interest in the issue. So there's a few excerpts taken from letters below. On the 2nd of May 1902, Major Thomas wrote to the Honourable the Premier, Perth, West Australia, and included the following concerning Handcock. As for Handcock, quote, "As for Handcock, the most that can be urged against him is that he had an exaggerated idea of patriotism and soldierly duty. He simply obeyed the orders of Morant, who alleged that the reprisals were legal and justifiable." On the 17th of May 1902, Thomas's letter to the Honourable John Lee, Premier of New South Wales, included the following. "I say and always will say that Handcock's life should have been spared, for he was a splendid stamp of a man with a young family. Also consider that Lieutenant Morant should not have been put to death, but your government, of course, is especially concerned with Handcock. He was a man for whom I had the very greatest regard. Whatever he did, and it was very little, was in conscientious obedience to orders received." Then Major Thomas has written to the Berlin Mission Society on the 6th of March 1903. This was as a result of a letter written to the British authorities by Mrs. Johanna Heers, widow of the Reverend, or we've heard from her in a few episodes ago. So this is his letter to the Berlin Mission Society, quote, "I'm sorry Mrs. Heath wrote a letter afterwards saying Lieutenant Handcock shot her husband. Lieutenant Handcock was fully discharged by the court of that offence, and I feel quite certain he was not the man who shot Reverend Heath. I've always said so, and I told Reverend Krause so. I doubt very much if the fighting Boers did it, but I strongly suspect a Boer who joined the English troops of doing it. I feel quite sure it was not Lieutenant Handcock." So, yeah, they weren't able to come to a conclusion on the Reverend's murder. But we do know that, that Handcock had confessed, but then he retracted it. So Major Thomas continued his letter writing for many years after the execution of Morant and Handcock. As late as the 9th of June 1921, he wrote a letter to Attorney General Stevens, for which the excerpt below is taken. He says, "The actual facts had never been made known. I have the whole of the papers. Morant and Handcock were scapegoats of the Empire, in truth, but Whitten's book loses many of the facts because he did not know all the facts. Perhaps I alone know them." But inexplicably, Major Thomas never revealed what he claimed to know. We also do not know what was in his letter to George Whitten dated September the 14th, 1929, but can reveal Lieutenant Whitten's reply in his statements or questions. So this is a full transcript of George Whitten's letter dated October the 21st, 1929, sent back to Major Thomas, and it was released in 1970, many years too late. So this is the letter. It says, "Dear Major Thomas, I was surprised to receive your interesting letter of the 14th of September. I intended writing before but could not seem to get a start. I've been settled here since 1908, dairy farming, making a living, and that is about all. Dry spells and droughts are too frequent for a man to become prosperous. That article in Smith's Weekly you read was inspired by a cousin of mine in Melbourne, a captain in the last war. I do not think it was you they were alluding to as the one who preferred to keep silent. Personally, I think the attitude you take with regard to Morant and Handcock and the Heath case is not the right one. I'm inclined to think that neither of them took you into their confidence over that case. Up to the time of the court of inquiry, when I was charged with complicity in his death, I had no more knowledge of how Heath came to his death than the babe unborn, nor did I have at any time the slightest suspicion that Morant or Handcock was connected with it. It staggered me at the time, but my statement in reply cleared me of that count at the inquiry. Subsequently, when we were allowed to see each other, Morant told me that Handcock had broken down and confessed to everything, including shooting Heath. I saw Handcock shortly afterwards and asked him about the Heath business. He said, why wasn't you standing beside Morant when he asked me if I was game to follow the missionary and wipe him out? I had been with him up to that time. Morant returned from interviewing Heath when he drove past the fort. I left them there and went to my old tent and did not see them again till they came to dinner about 7 o'clock. I believe Morant got Handcock to deny his previous statement in which he'd made a clean breast of everything, and they got to work to frame up an alibi, which you know was successful as the means of their acquittal. But you must not forget Kitchener held Handcock's confession in which he implicated me as an accessory, no doubt unwittingly done while in a high-strung nervous state. But that accounts for the reason why only Morant, Handcock and myself were punished, and the War Office was so adamant in my case. Had there been no Heath case, the shooting of prisoners would not have worried them much. But the shooting of Heath was a premeditated and most cold-blooded affair. Handcock with his own lips described it all to me. I consider I am the one and only one that suffered unjustly, apart from yourself. Morant and Handcock being acquitted, my lips were sealed. I would very much like to peruse the evidence of the Heath trial, although I took no part in it or was present. If you have a copy and would care to send it to me, I would take particular care of it and return it safely. Personally, I do not think there would be much in writing what you term the true story of the Bushveldt Carbineers, in fear of the facts that the War Office may still hold Handcock's confession. I have very little knowledge of any Bushveldt Carbineer officers. The last I heard of Picton was shortly after my return to Australia. He was riding racehorses on the continent. Hannam died about a year ago. Taylor, I never heard what happened to him. I saw Lenihan on my way to Queensland in 1908. He owed me £12 that he'd borrowed from me at Cape Town to see him home. The rotter promised to send it to me, but he never did, although he was making £2,000 a year. Bordernet stayed in South Africa mining. I still have a sister living in Pretoria. It was she who attended to Morant and Handcock's grave. I took no part whatever in the last war. When asked to volunteer, I said, yes, I'm Fisher's last man. He pledged Australia to the last man and the last shilling. Well, I hope things are going well with you and with regards to Mrs. Whitten and myself. Yours truly, G.R. Whitten.
Firing party! Standing! Load! Aim!
Shoot straight, you bastards! Don't make a mess of it!
Fire!
In a prison cell I sadly sit, a damn crestfallen chappie, and own to you I feel a little bit unhappy. It really ain't a place nor time to reel off rhyming diction, but yet we'll write a final rhyme while waiting crucifixion. No matter what end they decide, quick lime or boiling oil, sir, we'll do our best when crucified to finish off in style, sir. But we bequeath a parting tip for sound advice of such men who come across in transport ship to polish off the Dutchmen. If you encounter any Boers, you really must not loot them. And if you wish to leave these shores, for pity's sake, don't shoot them. And if you'd earn a DSO, why, every British sinner should know the proper way to go is ask the Boer to dinner. Let's toss a bumper down our throat before we pass to heaven and toast the trim-set petticoat we left behind in Devon. I don't remember when I first saw the 1980 Australian film Breaker Morant, but it impressed me that much that I hired out the VHS tape from the library, and I borrowed a player, invited my family over to see this must-see film. But by the time I worked out the technology of connecting the VHS player to my TV, getting the movie rolling, my family were all nodding off and snoring in their comfortable lounge chairs with the heater on. But that's the first time I remember learning about the breaker. But to this day, it's coloured and blurred my opinion of the real-life characters portrayed in the film: Morant, Handcock, Witten, and the Bushveldt Carbineers. So it's hard not to be influenced by those magnificent Australian actors, the dark, handsome, swarthy looks of John Waters as Captain Taylor, the Aussie blonde Jack Thompson, the knockabout larrikin Peter Handcock, played by Brian Brown, and the fantastic job done by Edward Woodward as the lead character. So it's hard not to like these characters and to feel injustice done to them. But that's my heart speaking. And it's true, Australians have a fondness for bushrangers, for not saluting English officers, bucking against that haughty class distinctions of British breeding versus us easygoing colonials. And when I met Charles, I asked him if there would be any interest at all in the case of the breaker if it wasn't for that Australian film in 1980, and he concurred that was a pretty good question. But let's put aside for the moment the imagery of the film and the actors and the stunning landscape, and let's look at some of the facts portrayed in the film. They concentrated on the three cases: the execution of Visser, the execution of surrendered prisoners, and the killing of the Reverend Heath. So when I met Charles, I had no idea of the killings of the Valdezia Six, which didn't really include Morant or Handcock, but showed the influence of Captain Taylor and the lawlessness of the Carbineers. The killing of Van Buren, apparently by Handcock, the Sweetwater's killings of Van Staden and his sons made to dig their graves, and the indiscriminate firing on the Boer women and children by Hannam, killing the two little boys. Plus, of course, the multiple killings of black Africans, which didn't even warrant investigation. So it's unlikely with all this time past we will ever know whether there was an order to shoot Boer prisoners issued by Captain Hunt, and if Captain Hunt had received that order from Pretoria, from Hamilton and Kitchener. But even if the order had been issued, it seemed arbitrary whether it was obeyed, because we know there were plenty of prisoners that were captured and sent to the concentration camp in Pietersburg before and after Hunt's death by Morant and other Bushveldt Carbineers, and even if there was an order to shoot prisoners and an obligation indeed to shoot prisoners, that doesn't explain the murder of the Reverend Heath or Van Buren or the killing of the little boys in the Boer lager by Hannam. I've got no doubt, or I believe, that Harry Morant was a good soldier. I think when he left Australia, he realised his time was closing. His alcohol, the lifestyle, owing money to people. It left him with few options of returning to Australia or, indeed, Britain. From being highly praised as a dispatch rider at the Battle of Diamond Hill, he was now a very changed man after the death of his friend Percy Hunt, and he used the excuse of the mutilation of Hunt as an outlet for his inner anger, demons, resentments, failings, and misguided duty. And a mutilation we now know was probably misunderstood. Peter Handcock is more complex, highly spoken of by superior officers and those that knew him, George Whitten, but he seems to have blindly followed Morant to be the hitman, the fixer, ordered by Harry. Interesting, that little nugget from the last letter of George Whitten to Major Thomas says all along Kitchener had the confession of Peter Handcock, which made it impossible to acquit the men after the murder of the Reverend Heath. But we were told if it wasn't for the murder of the Reverend, there would have been no trial. Yet they were acquitted of that murder. A lack of evidence. It's barely hinted at in the film. The general decline of morale of the Bushveldt Carbineers, the illegal stills, the harassing of women, stealing cattle, Captain Taylor's influence on them, the remoteness of the Spelonken, the poor quality of food rations, clothing, which created resentment and anger within the troopers towards their officers, and the sheer bloody exhaustion and insanity of the seemingly endless war. I've found other defence witnesses at the court-martial presenting many cases of Boers being shot after surrender or for wearing khaki, but they were dismissed by the judges as inconsequential to this trial. So, as much as my heart feels for the bush poet, the knockabout Bathurst lad, in that time and in that place, the verdict was probably the correct one. Were they scapegoats? I think yes, they were. Did they deserve firing squad? No, sadly, probably they did.
Remember who has made her soul. It's a soldier's